Today, I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about a subject which is really sort of close to my heart, and that's inclusion, and specifically how we can develop an electric vehicle charging infrastructure network that promotes inclusion, that ensures that the benefits of electric vehicles and electromobility are spread as evenly as possible throughout society. In the presentation, I'll provide a little bit of introduction and context to explain what I mean by inclusion in the context of electric vehicles. I'll also be talking about why inclusion isn't necessarily a foregone conclusion. We've got to work to ensure that we aren't leaving behind certain parts of society. With that in mind, what options do we have? Technology and approaches to improve inclusion, and then also how can we develop strategies and how can we make effective decisions today that will ensure that long-term inclusion is maximised. But before I crack on with that, I'll quickly just talk to you about Senex. Many of you may well know us mostly from the annual LCV show that we've ran at Millbrook for the last few years, but aside from that, we also run a non-profit, independent and impartial research consultancy. My role within that consultancy is looking predominantly at electric vehicle charging infrastructure, but also zero-emission infrastructure, including hydrogen and biofuels as well. To a lesser extent, the demand is always for electric vehicles these days. And that's really the end of the sales pitch, because I want to speak candidly with you today about a really important issue that after 5 years working in this sector, I feel is generally not discussed as much as I think it should be. So what do I mean by inclusive, and why is that relevant to electric vehicle charging infrastructure? Well, if you're anything like my mother, when you say the word inclusive, the first thing that comes to mind is a holiday in the Costas. That's obviously not what we're talking about here. So, to take the definition, if you describe a group or an organisation as inclusive, you mean that it allows all kinds of people to be part of it, rather than just one. So in the context of electric vehicles, that group is electric vehicle users, electric vehicle owners, leasers. Doesn't matter how they're using the vehicle, how they're owning the vehicle, it's making sure that as many people can do that as possible. And why is that actually relevant to electric mobility? Well, in this room, we probably understand the benefits of electromobility fairly well. Lower running costs, lower emissions, the environmental impact is lower, you can refuel at home, which has its own societal impacts and benefits, and the driving experience of the vehicle is more pleasant. And so, with all those good things in mind, we want as many people as possible to be able to access those benefits. One part of this is that as electric vehicles become more affordable, they'll naturally become more inclusive because more people will be able to purchase or lease the vehicles. But what I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail today is how the way that we provide charging infrastructure also has a really important direct impact on how widespread the benefits of electric vehicle infrastructure and electric vehicle use can be. A quick quote from Grant Shapps, actually, if Parliament is dissolved, is he technically still the Secretary of State? I'd not even considered that. But your postcode should play no part in how easy it is to use an electric car, and I'm determined that electric vehicles become the new normal for drivers. That is exactly the topic upon which I want to talk to you about today. So why is this not just something that's already happening? Why is this not simple? Why is it that we aren't already putting charging infrastructure in the ground, which is including as many people in society as possible? To explain this to you, I've prepared a bit of a hypothetical comparison between two fictional characters. So, meet Joe Bloggs and John Smith. I was in a creative mood when I came up with their names. They have the same income, same outgoings. They are practically the same in every way, aside from Joe having a moustache and John not. The only other way that they're different is that Joe lives in a semi-detached house with a driveway, and John Smith lives in a terraced townhouse. If they both owned exactly the same electric vehicle and drove it the same mileage every year, what happens? So you see that the cost per kilowatt hour for their public charging in transit when they're on the motorway is exactly the same, but the cost when they charge in residential locations is completely different because Joe Bloggs has access to domestic electricity costs. John Smith is stuck at around 25 pence per kilowatt hour to use public charging infrastructure. And the cumulative result of that is that every year, Joe Bloggs will save £200 more in fuel than John Smith. And therefore, your electric vehicle has created an inequality that didn't exist before. Now, we want to try and stop that from happening. So what's the obvious thing to do? Stick a charge point on the street outside of John Smith's house and charge him 15 pence per kilowatt hour to use it. What could possibly go wrong? Well, first thing that goes wrong is that the commercial business case for doing that is not particularly stable and not particularly investable. If you work through an example of how this all adds up, if you take a residential charge point and very optimistically assume that it could charge 2, let's say, new Nissan Leafs every single day, the amount of money that that would make would only be enough to generate £584 of net revenue per year, and that's before you take into account the operating costs. And at the end of all of that, you're unlikely to pay that charge point off inside of several years, if not decades. So we can't really expect a great deal of investment to go into that technology, which is part of the reason why the government has made funding available to local authorities to cover this sort of investment. The second point, and this one's a bit scary for me, if you took this approach with everybody, if you provided on-street charging infrastructure outside everyone's house where they don't have a driveway or a garage, the end result of that, if we use the same assumptions I had in the last slide, is that we'd need around 500,000 public charge points compared to the around 25,000 that we have now. That's scary, and bearing in mind that the business case is fairly weak, it's also not realistic, so we can't expect that to happen either. The third problem, and this is a bit more of a political issue, in the short term, if you stick that charge point outside John Smith's house, his neighbours start wondering why, or they start perceiving that John has been given a dedicated parking spot. And then they perceive there's been some sort of inequality. What has John Smith done to deserve this intervention from the council that's effectively given him a dedicated parking space? Let's say that his low-income neighbour has complained to the local councillor. The local councillor is now facing competition at the next local election from a candidate who's running using this as a weapon. And then from that point on, the local council are slightly disenfranchised from doing the same thing again unless it's done at a larger scale, and who knows when that will be. So what's the alternative to all of this? Well, one alternative to all of this is you can dangle a cable down the street. No. There's so many things wrong with doing this, and I love the fact that this article, the owner of that plug-in hybrid vehicle claimed that they'd minimized the trip hazard. I mean, if that's a minimized trip hazard, then yeah, there's a lot of problems with allowing or encouraging people to take this kind of route. The more sensible alternative, as Toddington was explained to us from what they're doing with GridServe at the moment, is to install banks of rapid and ultra-rapid charging equipment. And the benefits of this, firstly, are you don't need as many charge points. So that 500,000 number is for slower charge points where people are sitting on them overnight or in a long stay setting. If you move that to rapid and then to ultra-rapid charging, the amount of charging infrastructure you need on a national level goes down massively. And so that's one key benefit of this type of charging infrastructure. The business case is also more attractive because ultimately if the infrastructure is more powerful, it can provide more fuel and therefore generate more revenue. And it follows a similar business model to the more established petrol station, which means you've got the benefit that consumers have a familiar route to charging and refueling their vehicles as we move into the future. But that doesn't entirely solve the problem, as you can't expect a rapid or an ultra-rapid charge point operator to charge domestic electricity rates. I'm certain that Toddington's not intending on charging people 15 pence per kilowatt hour to use the charge points at GridServe, and that's not the case anywhere in the UK at the moment. You cannot get a rapid charger where you're going to be paying that kind of rate. Typically, it floats between around 25 pence and 40 pence per kilowatt hour, depending on what network and the location. And so Joe Bloggs will still be charging at home, and he'll still be pocketing the savings. So it's not entirely solved the problem. So either way, we've got a bit of a problem here. Actually, the positive way of looking at this, and I like to think I'm a glass half full kind of person, is whether they're charging on a 150 kilowatt charger or a 7 kilowatt charger, they're still accessing the benefits. Consumers can still access the benefits of electric vehicles, whether they're economic, environmental, or social. So actually, either way, it's good. The challenge that we have is to just make sure that those benefits are as fairly distributed as we can manage. There's no single way of doing this. We're not going to solve this with one technology, but there is definitely a balance to be struck. And the reason that I'm really happy to be talking with you today about this subject is that at the moment, I don't think we necessarily appreciate that balance. That's why I was really encouraged to hear Jonathan talking about that being included as part of the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force. So what options, what are the approaches and the technologies that we could use to try and address some of this imbalance? Well, the first one I'll talk about is novel on-street charging technologies. So some of these you'll be quite familiar with, others maybe less so. But the business case for residential on-street charging is not particularly attractive for conventional charging infrastructure, which is why several companies are now looking at lower profile infrastructure, typically with lower capital costs and also lower operating costs, so the business case is a bit more attractive. Another one of the benefits of these types of infrastructure is that they're usually simpler to install. I've heard that the lamp column chargers, for example, you can fit a whole street in one day, which is, that kind of thing is an incredible benefit if you're looking at rolling out a massive number of charging infrastructure in a short space of time. Also, removing street clutter. It's one less thing that people will complain about, and people do complain about street clutter. So if there's ways that we can avoid that, we want to take those measures. Another method that we can look at is variable tariffs and access. The technology exists that we could have certain user groups paying more or less than other user groups. And that might sound a little bit bonkers, because when you turn up to a petrol station, you don't get certain people paying less than others. It doesn't work like that. But in this situation, if we want to level the playing field and make sure those, for example, without off-street parking, can access similar tariffs to those with off-street parking, we have to look at these sorts of measures and consider them. If the business case for it exists, it's something that should be explored. A good example of where this kind of approach has been taken in London is TfL using technology similar to this to deploy rapid charge points that is specific to taxi use, because if everyone was allowed to use those charge points, the taxi drivers would not have the confidence to purchase the vehicles, and that's also a bit of a problem. Next one I'll talk about is e-car clubs. Now, for certain groups, purchasing an electric vehicle outright is not realistic, and for other groups, whether they can afford it or not, they might have some reason why they don't wish to buy a new vehicle. Personally, I think it's fairly sensible to look at a vehicle that's 1 or 2 years old, see that it's depreciated about £5,000, and actually at that point it represents really good value. So people with that kind of mindset, they might not be able to access the benefits of an electric vehicle for some years, because it's going to be a long time before you see like an old banger EV becoming a common sighting at the dealership. Actually, I suppose it'd be more of an old whiner if it was an electric vehicle. But they're not going to be around for a long time. So to allow people to access the benefits of electric vehicles in the shorter term, e-car clubs present a potential solution. I've got a photo here of one that was installed near to where I used to live in Poplar in East London, which has been installed into a very, very tight-knit community near Crisp Street Market, so really highly visible location. And Senex also delivered a project for Climate Kick called Inclusive EV, which looked at rolling these out in less affluent neighbourhoods. The last point there, it's important to engage with communities before deploying. Very important point. Those car club vehicles that were deployed through the Inclusive EV project were subsequently vandalised and written off because the vandalism was that bad. And we have attributed that to poor community engagement. And so it's very, very key that if you do deploy e-car clubs, the community is on board with it and they understand the value of them. And for example, smashing the windows isn't a victimless crime because there's a community benefit there which is being lost. Lastly, solar photovoltaics and battery storage. The benefit of this is that you're ultimately generating very low-cost electricity. And that means that you can use more attractive tariffs. It means that all of a sudden that 15 pence per kilowatt hour is not being gobbled up by a wholesale electricity rate. You're actually making all of that effectively is revenue. The capital costs that this adds are considerable, and the business case for it tends to be quite specific to certain locations with certain constraints. But nonetheless, it's an option, and one that increasingly is being considered, especially in charging hubs. And last one, I was going to say spoiler alert, but actually the agenda was flipped around a bit, so my spoiler has been spoilt. But you've heard quite a lot about planning requirements and what the government is doing to ensure that the UK housing stock, as it develops and renews, is equipping itself with electric vehicle charging infrastructure in domestic settings, because that will allow people to access the benefits that I discussed earlier. So with all that in mind, all those options in mind, what can we do to make the right decisions? Now, the first thing I'll talk about here, whole network business planning. I mentioned earlier that if you take a single charge point, generally speaking, the higher power it is, the more vehicles it can charge, the more revenue it can generate, the better the business case. And the commercial business case tends to stop at that point. The next bit down is where we start talking about how do we actually push this to promote inclusion. If you take those profitable charge points and use that to subsidize the less profitable charge points, what you invariably find is that the entire network retains its profitability, because the actual costs involved in the slower charging infrastructures are quite low, but the usage is also so low that you don't make the money back. As soon as you factor in the profit from rapid and ultra-rapid charging infrastructure in a whole network environment, you start to see that the profit can be made from a top-down perspective. CENEX works with a number of public and private organisations to deliver this kind of work. We look at electric vehicle adoption forecasts. We model the amount of infrastructure required on the basis of that, and then using market insights, we can understand what the costs and benefits of that would be. Second thing, inclusive charge point site selection. This is equal measures just good practice, but also from an economic perspective, but also good practice from a social inclusion perspective. You want to pick sites where as many different user groups as possible can use the infrastructure. So I've listed a few of the common user groups there: residents, commercial fleets, taxi and private hire vehicles, employees, customers, tourists. If you can identify locations which can tick the boxes for all of those user groups, and then also narrow it down by whether there's an available electrical supply that can support an installation there, actually, once you've taken all that into account, you're not usually left with that many locations. And so instantly you can start your planning, and you don't have to worry about, oh, is this the right place or is that the right place? It goes from hundreds of potential locations to sometimes less than 10. We use geospatial data sets to identify areas on this basis. We'll look at points of interest and then be able to understand how those locations could be used by electric vehicle users. Next, if you look at demand for public residential charging infrastructure, what are we actually looking for? In the short term, we want to install charging infrastructure where there's higher vehicle ownership, there's low levels of off-street parking availability. We want places with higher incomes where people can afford the vehicles and are likely to purchase them. We want to look at areas that are less deprived. We also want places where typically people commute by car and have higher mileages. And in the short term, that's very much about putting the infrastructure where it's going to be required right now. In the medium and long term, we need to start looking at the groups that can't purchase the vehicles today, but we want them to be able to access the benefits of them tomorrow. So we map the areas that look at low vehicle ownership, still with less off-street parking, lower income, higher levels of deprivation, areas where people commute by car or would at least ideally commute by car if they had access to a vehicle. And actually, all the data required to do this is freely available through the census. And there are other data sets, such as Experian Mosaic, which will allow you to analyze the same sort of thing. And CENEX uses these demographic factors. We've developed an index which you can spread across a local area, which will show you relatively which locations are more ideal for residential charging infrastructure. And my last meaningful slide here is just talking about long-term strategy. If we think of what we're doing today as picking the low-hanging fruit, which I think it's generally accepted that that is what we're doing for the next probably 5 years, what we actually need to be doing is considering how we get to the top of the tree. How do we get those hard-to-reach areas and make sure they're included in our present-day strategies? At what point are we going to need the ladder to climb up the tree, and how big does that ladder need to be? So the quick wins are all well and good, but ultimately we need to develop an inclusive strategy for the long term, and therefore we need to consider the groups that are less able to access the benefits of e-mobility and make sure that we're actually meeting their demand as well as those people who can purchase a vehicle tomorrow if they want to. So to summarise, benefits of electric vehicles, they're well known, and without careful planning, those benefits might be disproportionately spread to certain areas of society, and we want to avoid that. As EVs become more affordable, more people will be able to purchase them. That's half the battle. We also need to make sure that infrastructure is in the right places and the right types at the right price to make sure that inclusivity is boosted as much as we can. Technologies that can do that already exist, and more technologies and approaches are being developed. And careful planning, effective decision-making is what we need right now. And we need to make sure that this is part of our plans, that inclusion is part of our plans. And that's something that I'm quite passionate about and would welcome the opportunity to talk to any of you today in more detail about that. So thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.